Imagine a boy abandoned in the desert without bread, without water, on the brink of death. His mother weeps but steps away, unable to watch her son die. He has no future. He has no inheritance. He was rejected by his own family, forgotten by his father, abandoned by the promise. But then the heavens answer. A voice breaks the deadly silence. God heard the voice of the boy. This moment, lost among the pages of the Bible, carries one of the most mysterious and powerful acts of redemption in all of Scripture. How did a despised son become the father of princes? Why do the prophets mention his name centuries later? And what does Ismael represent for those who today live in the shadow of oblivion? This is not just the story of a survivor. It is the portrait of all those who have been rejected yet heard by God. There is a hidden secret behind Ismael's life, a secret that spans centuries and still echoes today in the sands of the East. You are about to discover why Ismael was never just a biblical character. Keep watching to uncover the truth behind the untold story of Ishmael, the rejected son who heard the voice of God. Join us as we explore how Ismael became a symbol of faith, resilience, and promise even after being rejected and forgotten by many. A barren plain between Canaan and Egypt. The heat punishes the sand. A woman walks alone. She is pregnant, weak, panting. The surrounding silence seems deafening, but someone hears. His name was Ismael, but even before he took his first breath, before he opened his eyes to the world, he had already been called by God himself. It wasn't Abraham who chose the name, not Hagar either. The name came from heaven, a name that carried a promise, but also a weight. Ismael, which means God is heard. It was not a name chosen by preference, but as an answer to a cry of despair. Yet the birth of Ismael would not be the end of his suffering. It would only be the beginning. Ismael was the son of Abraham, the patriarch, with Hagar, an Egyptian servant. Hagar was not chosen out of love but out of desperation. Sarah, Abraham's legitimate wife, was barren, and in a human attempt to force the fulfillment of a divine promise, she gave her servant to her husband. That is how Hagar conceived. But what began as a solution soon turned into an open wound. Between two women, a seed was growing, and with it, the poison of jealousy. Pregnant, Hagar fled. The tension became unbearable. Sarah's words were as sharp as blades, and her presence a burden. But in the midst of the desert, Hagar fell to her knees without strength, without water, without direction. And there, on the brink of survival, an angel of the Lord appeared. He saw her. He heard her. And he said something that would change everything. Behold, you are pregnant and will bear a son. You shall call his name Ismael, because the Lord has heard your affliction. Genesis 16:11. She was fleeing from pain and found the ye gaze of God. But the angel did not stop there. He revealed what Ismael would be. He shall be a wild donkey of a man. His hand will be against everyone, and everyone's hand against him. Genesis 16:12. An untamable spirit. A man of conflict. A natural warrior. That child would not grow up in a cradle of gold, but under the scorching sun and cutting sand. The boy would not be shaped by tents, but sculpted by the desert wind. Hagar, astonished, prostrated herself, her tears mixed with the hot dust. For the first time, someone, better yet, God himself, had recognized her pain. And she declared, "You are the God who sees me." Genesis 16:13. The place where it all happened was called Bir Lairoi, which means the well of the one who sees me. There the invisible made itself present, and the boy's name became eternal. Hagar returned. She returned to the camp. She returned to Sarah. But she was no longer the same. In her womb, not only a child was growing, but a living promise. Time passed, and then on a silent night, Ismael was born. Abraham took him in his arms and called him by the name that came from heaven. He loved him deeply. He raised him with tenderness. But a father's love does not always protect against a woman's war. Ismael grew up among tents and herds. He was not educated in schools, but by the calloused hands of shepherds. He learned to identify tracks, to listen to the wind, to respect the silence of the night. He was not like the children of princes. He was a child of dust and sun. His heart was pure, but it carried the weight of a divided household. And even in his childlike smile, there was something that disturbed Sarah. Decades later, Ismael would have 12 sons. They would become princes and tribal leaders. Their names are recorded in Genesis 25:13-16. Nibay, Kedar, Adil, Mibam, Mishma, Duma, Massa, Hadad, Tema, Jetur, Naphis, and Kedema. His wife chosen by Hagar was Egyptian. He did not build palaces. He set up tents. He did not possess armies. But his people dominated the desert routes. But before forming a nation, he would need to survive the exile. Ismael lived centuries before Christ. Long before the birth of Jesus in Bethlehem, Ismael was already walking the arid trails between Canaan and Egypt. He did not know the Messiah, but his people would see centuries later another prophet arise in his lineage. His goal to survive, to defend, to lead. He was a patriarch in times of dust and sword, a survivor. But even those who survive carry wounds that time does not heal. The silence between the tents said more than words. Hagar walked with measured steps. Ishmael ran among the flocks, laughing like any boy. But not everyone smiled with him. Sarah's eyes, the legitimate wife of Abraham, followed the boy's every gesture with a mixture of coldness and unease. He was the servant's son, but he was also her husband's firstborn. Ismael did not know the weight he carried. He was just a child. He ran free, climbed rocks, touched the sheep, and hid behind the tent curtains as if the world were nothing more than a game. He did not understand why sometimes Sarah's gaze froze the atmosphere, or why the servants averted their faces when they saw him approach. He simply lived. Abraham, already in his advanced age, loved that son deeply. Many times he took him along to visit the wells or to count the stars. And when he looked at Ishmael, he saw the promise he had long awaited becoming real. It was his flesh, his blood, his son. He was the one who first called him father. Yet every time Ismael sat beside Abraham, something trembled within Sarah. Something she tried to hide with subdued smiles and delicate gestures. But that did not escape Hagar's notice. There were days when she didn't utter a single word. Others when she looked at the boy with tear-airy eyes, unsure if it was anger, guilt, or frustration. One afternoon when the sun was already hiding behind the dunes, Ismael approached Sarah with a bouquet of wild flowers that he had picked himself. It was an innocent gesture. He held out his small hands and smiled, but instead of receiving a hug, he got silence. She looked at the flowers, then at him, and simply said, "Go play with your mother." Hagar, who observed everything from afar, felt her heart tighten, not for her sake, but for him, for Ismael. She knew she had given birth to a son of Abraham, but she would never be recognized as part of that promise made to the patriarch. She knew there was a place for the boy in the father's arms, but not in the heart of the household, and as the days passed, coexistence became more fragile. A plate slammed forcefully on the table, a sidelong glance during a meal, a compliment Sarah paid to the children of the neighboring servants, but one she never directed to Ismael. Small poisoned needles invisible to those not paying attention. But that cut deeply into those already wounded. Abraham tried to balance the affections. He loved Sarah, with whom he had dreamed his entire life. But he also loved Ismael, the one whom God had promised to bless. He saw the growing tension, but his heart fell silent. And in that silence, the boy ran back and forth, innocent, oblivious to the silent war his smile provoked. There were nights when Sarah remained awake, staring at the tent ceiling, listening to Ismael's footsteps outside, playing with the animals, and she wondered, why did he come first? Why did the servant's womb open and mine not? She tried to find peace. But within her, something grew, something that had no name yet, but that would soon turn into action. Ismael was growing, and with him, the unease within the tent grew as well. Abraham's love, which had once been a consolation for Sarah, was now a constant reminder that the servant's son existed, and he lived, and he grew, and he laughed, and he called his husband father. Every step Ismael took was another stone in Sarah's heart. Time passed. The lines on Abraham's face deepened, and Sarah's hair turned silver under the desert sun. Yet the silence in her womb seemed to scream louder and louder. Ismael was no longer a baby, but a boy, growing strong with firm steps and an alert gaze. He ran among the tents, climbed over rocks, and followed the shepherds at a distance. But even with him there, Sarah felt an emptiness that not even the sound of a child's laughter could fill. Because that laughter wasn't hers, Abraham, now nearly 100 years old, still remembered the promise. It was impossible to forget. God had said his descendants would be as numerous as the stars. But a decade had passed since Ismael's birth, and no new word came from heaven. No confirmation, no visit, only the sound of the wind and the hidden sobs of the woman at his side. Until one day everything changed. 3 men appeared on the plains of Mamre. They carried no weapons and rode no horses. Their garments were simple, but there was something in their eyes that was not of this world. Abraham ran to greet them, as was his custom, and invited them to rest under the trees. He ordered bread, water, milk, and meat to be prepared. He honored them with hospitality, unaware that he stood before something eternal. As they ate, one of them spoke, his authority freezing Sarah's heart as she listened from the tent entrance. "Truly, I will return to you at this time next year, and Sarah, your wife, shall have a son." Genesis 18:10. Sarah choked on laughter, not a joyful laugh, but a stifled, almost cynical sound, carrying years of waiting, pain, shame, and frustration. "After I am worn out and my Lord is old, shall I have pleasure?" she murmured to herself. But the one who spoke heard. "Why did Sarah laugh?" he asked calmly. "Is anything too wonderful for the Lord? At the set time I will return to you at this time next year, and Sarah shall have a son." Genesis 18:13-14. Sarah denied it, claiming she had not laughed, but the man, the angel of the Lord, replied gently but without hesitation, "No, you did laugh." Genesis 18:15. After that the visitors departed, but their words remained like firebrands seared into Sarah's ears. The days that followed were full of silence, heavier than the stones of the tent. Abraham watched his wife with tenderness and mystery. He did not know what to expect, but something inside him whispered that the time of the promise was nearer than ever. Sarah, on the other hand, tried to stifle her hope. It was easier to remain barren than to hope and be disappointed again. She did not want to nurture a dream only to see it die once more. But her body began to change. What had been fatigue turned into a deep sleep. What had been aversion to food became appetite, and then one day she felt it not pain but movement. Life. With trembling hands she touched her belly, and there in the very depths of her being she knew the promise had arrived. The months dragged by between fear and faith. Abraham seemed younger, as if each day renewed in him a forgotten joy. And when at last the time came, on the quiet of a starry night, Sarah gave birth. The baby's cry cut through the dry air like a soft thunderclap. Sarah laughed, but now it was a true laugh full of tears and gratitude. Abraham took the boy in his arms. His name would be Isaac, which means laughter. Genesis 21:3-6. "God has given me laughter," Sarah said, "and everyone who hears will laugh with me." But not everyone laughed. Hagar watched from a distance. Ismael, now about 14, looked on curiously at the newborn. He did not understand what it signified, but something within him shifted. A space once entirely his was about to be shared. The full attention that once belonged only to him would now be divided in two. And more than that, the blood of the child crying in that tent was the blood of the rightful wife, the blood of the promise. In the days that followed, joy took over the camp. Feasts were prepared, animals were sacrificed. Isaac grew strong and healthy. All eyes turned to him, and Ismael, he was still there, but no longer the center, no longer the only one. During the weaning feast, a culturally significant event of the time, Ismael was seen laughing. A simple laugh, perhaps teasing or just the spontaneous outburst of a teenager. But Sarah saw it, and that was the final straw, as she approached Abraham and said, Cast out this slave woman with her son, for the son of this slave woman shall not share in the inheritance with my son Isaac. Genesis 21:10. Abraham was deeply dismayed. He loved Ishmael, his firstborn. But that very night God spoke to him. Do not let it be displeasing in your sight because of the boy or your slave woman. Whatever Sarah says to you, do as she tells you, for through Isaac shall your offspring be named. Yet I will make a nation of the son of the slave woman also, because he is your offspring. Genesis 21:12 and 13. And so with a heavy heart, Abraham prepared a skin of water and some bread, and sent away Hagar and Ishmael. What had been silence now turned to weeping and division. Before we continue, we ask for your support. Subscribe to the channel and leave a like on the video to help us keep spreading these powerful Bible stories. Now, let's follow the exciting journey of Ishmael. The sun beat down mercilessly that day. The tents were draped in colorful fabrics. Animals had been slaughtered, and the scent of roasting meat filled the camp. The servants rejoiced. There were claps, smiles, and music. Isaac, the son of promise, was being weaned, a major milestone in their culture. Abraham watched the celebration, his face serene, but his eyes misty. He had waited so many years for this moment. Isaac was healthy and joyful, clinging to his father's legs. Sarah could not contain herself. Her face shone like never before. She smiled with her lips, with her healed womb, with her restored soul. Off to the side in silence stood Hagar. She did not join the dances or the conversations. Her gaze remained fixed on one place. Ishmael, now about 16, a teenager among men, no longer a child yet no longer finding his place. Ishmael watched the festivities intently. Sometimes he laughed with the others. At other times he slipped away with a sober look. No one truly knew what stirred in his heart. Only Hagar understood him. That day she felt a strange weight hanging in the air. As the party continued, someone saw Ishmael mockingly laughing, perhaps at something Isaac did, perhaps mimicking a gesture or simply drawing attention in typical adolescent fashion. But Sarah saw it. To her it was more than a joke. It was a threat and affront, the spark that ignited every insecurity still burning within her. She approached Abraham, her eyes steady and her heart aflame. Cast out this slave woman and her son, for the son of this slave shall not share in the inheritance with my son Isaac. Genesis 21:10. Abraham froze. Those words cut deeper than any sword. Expel Ishmael, his firstborn, the boy he had held in his arms, taught to walk, to hunt, to pray, to serve. He felt the ground tremble beneath him. He tried to reason, but the words died on his lips. Sarah did not relent. Her once wounded gaze was now unyielding. She would have no more division, no more shadows around her son. Isaac must be sole heir, sole focus, sole promise. That night, Abraham did not sleep. He paced in circles, prayed in silence, gazed at the stars as he had since youth, since God's first voice called to him. And there, in the stillness of midnight, God spoke again. Do not be distressed because of the boy or because of your slave woman. Whatever Sarah tells you, do as she says. For through Isaac your offspring will be named. Yet I will make a nation of the son of the slave woman also, because he is your offspring. Genesis 21:12-13. Abraham fell to his knees as if heaven itself confirmed his anguish. At dawn, before the sun fully rose, he approached Hagar's tent. He carried a skin of water, a piece of bread, and eyes that did not know how to say goodbye. Hagar looked at him in silence. She asked no questions, shed no tears. She knew Abraham offered the skin with trembling hands, touched his son's shoulder, attempted a smile, but could not. Ishmael, confused, did not understand what was happening. His gaze searched his father's eyes and found only pain. No farewell was spoken aloud, only the sound of the leather skin being strapped, the cloth drawn over Hagar's head, and footsteps beginning a new journey. Not a journey, an exile. Hagar walked on, her son by her side. The desert before them seemed endless. Each step was a question, each gust of wind a cutting silence. Idmael looked back, hoping his father would change his mind. But the tents shrank to mere shadows on the horizon. They were alone. The sun grew cruel by the hour. The sand burned their feet. The water dwindled. The bread hardened. The silence between mother and son grew thick. Neither dared speak the truth. They both knew they had been left to die. But something inside Ismael resisted. Something he did not yet fully understand. A spark inherited from his father. A faith not yet named, but burning in his young breast like a forgotten promise. And Hagar? She kept her eyes on the ground, one foot after another, one breath after another. The boy at her side was not just her child. He was all she had. The only part of her that God had seen. The very tent that once sheltered him, now cast him to the wind. The desert heat was not just a matter of climate. It was a sentence, a cruel and silent judge. Every gust of wind carried grains of sand that stung like tiny invisible shards. The sky above was a bronze ceiling, impenetrable, and the ground below an endless, thirsty expanse. Hagar walked with burning feet, her sandals torn by the rough earth of Persia. Ismael followed her, but his steps no longer held the firm stride of the boy who once ran freely among Abraham's flocks. The sun seared their skin and the two trembled, not from the cold but from weakness. The silence between them was stronger than any conversation. She knew where she did not want to go, back to the tent where she had been rejected. But where could they go now? Where was the promised water, the rest, the fulfillment of that ancient word from God? The same desert that years ago had been the stage for her salvation now seemed to whisper death. The leather jar hung empty from her shoulder. She had already pounded it, trying to hear a sound. She tried to squeeze it with her hands, turn it upside down, shake it as if a drop were hidden at the bottom, but there was nothing left. No water, no hope. Ismael, gasping, stumbled. Hagar caught him before he fell completely. The boy leaned against a rock, breathing with difficulty. His lips were cracked. His tongue stuck to the roof of his mouth. His eyes were glazed. Even so, he did not complain. He did not cry. He did not beg. He simply endured. It was that silence that cut Hagar's heart the most. She embraced him for a while. She tried to smile, to say that they would find a way, that the sun would set soon, that at night the air would be cooler, but she herself did not believe it. Her body trembled, her knees buckled, and then she made a terrible decision to walk away. She knew what was coming. She placed her son beneath a small, dry bush, a scanty shade that barely covered his head, but it was all she had. Ismael did not protest. He simply lay down. He closed his eyes, his body sweating, his hands open by his side, and his chest rising and falling slowly, more and more slowly. Hagar walked only a few steps, not many, but enough so that he was out of her sight. Enough so that he would not see death. She sat on the ground apart, hiding her face in her arms, and she wept. She wept with her soul, with her very being, with everything inside her. She wept like a mother who sees life slipping away from her hands without being able to hold it. She wept without words, without explanations, an ancient deep cry, dry like the desert itself. Let me not see the boy die. Genesis 21:16. It was all she managed to say. Ismael remained lying there. His chest still moved, but it was almost imperceptible. He no longer cried, but he felt the pain of thirst, the pain of abandonment, the pain of rejection, and then something inside him broke. It was not a shout. It was not a cry of despair. It was a muffled weeping, a faint sound almost imperceptible. But it rose not to his mother's ears, not to the ears of the men, but to the heavens. It was the voice of a rejected boy that God heard, there in the silence of the desert, where there was no more bread, no water, no visible promises. God heard Ismael's cry. And it was not the first time. The same God who had spoken to Hagar years before. The same God who had told her that that boy would become a great nation. The same God who saw her when everyone else ignored her. Saw again, and he heard. Because God does not ignore the forgotten. God does not silence in the face of the silence of the small. He does not turn his face from those whom the world rejects. At that moment, between Hagar's sobs and Ismael's weakened body, the sky opened quietly. Not with thunder nor with brilliant lights, but with presence. An invisible presence, yet as real as the heat that burned the sand. Hagar still hiding. Her face did not immediately realize it, but something had changed. God was there. There were no more cries, only a weeping that reached up to God. The desert fell silent, a dense, cutting silence. Not even birds flew, not even insects whispered. There was only the sound of the wind and the low, labored breathing of pain. Hagar was seated, distant, her face buried in her hands. Her body bowed, her heart shattered. Her soul no longer screamed. It merely throbbed like an incurable wound. Before her lay the son she had carried in her womb, now sprawled on the hot sand between life and death. There was nothing but dust and heat. But God was there. And when everything seemed lost, the sky spoke. Hagar. The voice was clear, firm, and yet gentle. Slowly she lifted her face. The air seemed different, a new breath. It did not come from the side, it did not come from the ground, it came from above. What is the matter, Hagar? Fear not, for God has heard the voice of the boy from where he is. Genesis 21:17. She froze. That voice. She knew it. It was the same one she had heard years ago when she fled pregnant through the desert. The same voice that had told her Ismael would live, that he would grow, that he would become a great nation. The same voice that saw her when no one else did. Now she heard it again, but this time it was not for her. It was for him, for Ismael. Read, "Take the boy by the hand, for I will make him a great nation." Genesis 21:18. Hagar rose with difficulty. Her legs still trembled. Her eyes remained moist, but something had changed. Those words carried weight. Weight of a promise, weight of truth, weight of eternity. She looked at the boy. His smile still breathed. His chest moved slowly, his face dirty, his mouth dry, but he was alive. And then Hagar's eyes of a mother, of a servant, of a weary woman, were opened. And God opened her eyes, and she saw a well of water. Genesis 21:19. She blinked, looked again. And there it was. A well. It was not a mirage. It was not a product of despair. It was real. As real as the thirst, as real as the suffering, as real as the promise made years before. The well had been there all along, but she had not seen it. Not because it wasn't there, but because her eyes had been closed by fear, by pain, by abandonment, and it was God who had opened them. Hagar ran. Yes, she ran with the last of her strength. She ran to the well. She knelt. She filled the jar quickly, her hands trembling yet filled with faith. She ran back to Ismael. Gently she lifted his head, poured the water over his parched lips, then into his mouth, and then over his forehead. And then he breathed more deeply. Life returned. Ismael opened his eyes, weak but alive. He looked at his mother, then at the sky, and there, at that moment, under the sun that had once condemned them, the promise was revived. Hagar wept. But now it was different. It was not lament. It was relief. It was gratitude. It was awe. She looked at the well and remembered, "You are the God who sees me." But now she could also say, "You are the God who hears me." And there in the silence of the desert with no witnesses but the heavens, God reaffirmed. Ismael would live and he would become a great nation. He would not be a servant. He would not be a shadow. He would not be forgotten. He would be a leader, a patriarch, a name among names. The boy who had been cast into the dust was standing again, not by the hands of men, but by the hands of God. The desert had not changed. The heat still burned. The hardships did not vanish. But now there was a well, a place of provision, an eternal sign that not every drought is the end. Ismael rose. Water trickled down his chin. His eyes shone with renewed life. His muscles were still weak, but his steps sought firmness. And Hagar by his side smiled through tearful eyes. That very well would remain there, a silent witness to divine intervention, a place where heaven descended to the earth, not in glory, but in mercy. And Hagar would never forget it. From death sprang forth the promise that no one else could see. The desert did not forgive, but it did not forget either. The sand marked by the footprints of Hagar and Ishmael held stories that the wind could not erase. After her eyes were opened to the well of survival, Hagar decided to no longer live by what others left behind. She raised a new tent in a remote place, a place where no one would dictate where she should tread or whom she should call mistress. And there, among stones and heat, Ishmael grew. He grew up without the protection of Abraham's tents. He grew up without the privilege of an inheritance. But he also grew up without restraints, without demands, without masks. His teacher was the wind, his book, the boundless landscape, his school, the struggle for every drop of water and every morsel of bread. From an early age, his body adapted, his muscles developed, his feet hardened, his eyes became as alert as those of predators. He learned to walk silently, to follow tracks in the sand, to distinguish fresh footprints from old ones. He learned to listen to the breathing of a gazelle 100 meters away. The first time he wielded a bow was with crooked wood and a rope braided from fibers. His fingers bled, but he did not give up. Day after day he returned to the same place, and when at last his arrow flew straight and true, striking a stone with force, he smiled, and the desert seemed to smile with him. Ishmael became an archer, not for sport, but for survival. Hagar watched him with proud, silent eyes. She never interfered. She knew that the desert would be his tutor and thirst his discipline. It was not a time for protection. It was a time for growth. And the boy was being forged. The nights were cold. Many times they slept embraced in silence, listening to the crackling of the sand and the distant howls of animals. Ishmael did not ask about Abraham, but sometimes when he gazed at the stars, his eyes fixed on one spot as if waiting for an answer that never came. The only certainty he had was that the promise was still alive. God had said, "I will make him a great nation." But all around him was only dust, stone, and silence. No people, no clan, no raised banner, only him, his mother, and the parched land. Yet that land accepted him, and he accepted it in return. He learned to find water where ordinary eyes saw only desolation. He discovered hidden wells, stones that provided shade, roots that offered moisture. He became one with the land, one with the climate, one with the animals that dwelt there. In time, the fame of his name began to spread. Ishmael, the warrior of the south, the man who hunted with his eyes closed, the one whose arrow never missed its mark. Nomads who crossed his path spoke of him with respect, some with fear, others with admiration. But even there, even with his recognized strength, he was alone. Hagar knew it. And in her maternal heart, she also knew that it was time for her son to have a home, even if it was made of tents. A name beyond his own, someone to share the fire, the nights, the stories, the rare smiles he still managed to show. Then she journeyed down to Egypt, her land of origin, and from there brought a wife for Ishmael. We do not know her name, but we know of her origin. Egyptian like Hagar, someone who would understand the sands, the customs, and value silence as a form of communication. The wedding was simple. There was no feast like those in the lands of Canaan. There were no noble guests, but there was a kindled fire, there was bread shared, there were eyes meeting eyes. And there was an alliance, and so the boy became a man. His own tent was now his steps broader, his voice firmer, his shadow larger. But inside him, something still sought. He was strong, he was feared, he was a hunter, a protector, a husband. But his heart carried a restlessness that even the desert could not quiet. For as much as his feet had adapted to the sand, his soul still yearned for solid ground. He could not say what it was. An emptiness, a calling, a distant memory of a father who loved him, but who had left, of a home that had embraced him yet expelled him, of a promise made, but not yet fulfilled. The desert had given him a home, but it had not given him rest. His wife gave him children, but not answers. The bow gave him sustenance, but not an inheritance. The desert was his dwelling, but his soul still searched for a place of peace. Time in the desert is not measured by clocks or bells. It is told by the cycle of the sun and the wear on one's sandals. Each wrinkle on the face is a memory, every lost tooth a lesson, every scar a story that the desert wrote without asking. But for permission, Ishmael was now a full-grown man. The boy from the well had become a warrior, a hunter, a father. The years had carved on him a determined expression, eyes that read the horizon and calloused hands that knew how to build, protect, and guide. Hagar, his mother, now older, looked upon her son with silent pride. She spoke little. It was unnecessary. The way she kneaded the bread, adjusted the tent, guarded the jar. Everything was a reverence for the journey they had lived. Ismael's tent, once lonely, was now merely one among many. Around him, clans began to emerge. It was not from one day to the next. It happened gradually. The children he had with his Egyptian wife began to grow. Men like him, born under the scorching sun, raised to the sound of the winds and forged in the struggle for every drop of water. In time, Ismael's sons formed their own tents. There were 12 of them as recorded in Genesis 25:13-16. Nebi, Kedar, Adbil, Mibam, Mishma, Duma, Massa, Hadad, Tamar, Jetur, Naphis, and Kadma. Each of them carried the blood of the exile. Each inherited not lands, but the spirit of a father who learned to master the land that no one else wanted. None of them inherited walls, but all inherited the wind, free, fierce, and constant. They did not have cities, but they had territory. They did not have thrones, but they had tents raised with dignity, and those tents began to spread like seeds. Carried on the wind, merchants passing through their lands found steadfast hospitality. Nomadic groups seeking passage found respect, and those who sought confrontation met resistance. The tribes led by Ismael had no kings, but they knew whom they would follow, the one who survived where no one else did. The 12 sons formed clans. These clans spread. At first it was merely a family group, but soon they came to be recognized by other peoples as a nation of the desert. A people who did not bend, a people who knew the silence of the night and the weight of the sand, a people without walls, but with identity. Ismael did not wear crowns, but he was heard. He did not bear scepters, but his word was law among his own. He was called a patriarch, and even those who once mocked his origins now bowed their heads in his presence. For they knew he was different. He was not molded by luxury, but by loss, not strengthened by grandeur, but by abandonment. He did not know what it was to be protected, only how to protect. He was a leader, but he was also a living memory, a reminder that God hears, a reminder that the rejected are not forgotten, a reminder that a nation can be born from a cry in the desert. And even though he was respected, even though he had children, even though he saw his tents multiply across the dry plains, Ismael still carried something within him, a silence that age could not heal, an absence that even time could not erase. He still remembered his father's face, Abraham, the hand that held him, the look that could not say goodbye, the moment when his tent was left behind, and the day he was sent away into nothingness with a jar of water and a piece of bread. Ismael knew that he was not chosen to inherit the fields of Canaan, but he also knew now more than ever that God had chosen him for much more. While others sought an inheritance, he was laying roots in the dust. While others fought for territory, he was spreading tents wherever the wind blew. While kings died and their kingdoms were taken, Ismael watched his sons grow, his clans flourish, his stories multiply across the desert routes. He taught his children how to find hidden wells, how to hunt in silence, how to defend without striking first. But above all, he taught them to endure. For that was his hallmark, resilience. There were no stone altars nor sacred books recorded in his name. But there was a legacy, an echo, a presence, a living memory in every grain of sand. Those who slept beneath his tents knew this. That man was not ordinary. He was not merely a family leader. He was a patriarch of a promise that had not yet been fully revealed. And every time the wind blew across the camps of his sons, it was as if the heavens whispered to him, "I am still here." He had no inheritance, but he was creating a nation. The desert sands have a memory. They cover ancient footprints, yet they do not forget. They hide bones, yet they preserve stories. And among these sands, where the sky meets the earth in an endless line, Ishmael and his sons learned that living in freedom comes at a price. In the beginning, there was only space. Space to spread out tents, to raise flocks, to seek water where there was none. But space in the desert is more precious than gold, and soon other eyes coveted what Ishmael had attained. The conflicts did not begin with shouts. They came stealthily. A well claimed a flock attacked under cover of night, a messenger who never returned, a rumor among clans about disputed lands. Thus began the silent wars. Ishmael knew he had no walls. His sons did not have armies of trained soldiers or finely wrought bronze weapons, but they possessed something no king could measure, the ability to endure. His men knew the terrain better than the invaders did. They knew how to move among the rocks, hide among the dunes, discern when the winds shifted, and when the sand betrayed. The enemy, the tribes of Kedar, Nebaioth, and Jetur, sons and grandsons of Ishmael, began to organize not merely as families but as defenders of their identity. They did not aspire to conquer cities. They simply wanted to live in peace in the land the heavens had granted them. But peace cannot be purchased. Soon the neighboring kingdoms realized that this nomadic, wandering people was far harder to subdue than they had imagined. The Babylonians came. The Assyrians came. Caravan guards armed and intent on controlling the desert's trade routes arrived with their maps, soldiers, and plans of domination. Yet, whenever they drew too near, they vanished. Not because Ishmael was cruel, but because no one could wrest from the sand what it had embraced as its own. The first battles were swift, precise, ambushes, arrows launched with pinpoint accuracy, fires kindled at strategic points in the night. When the enemies arrived, the tents had already been moved, all traces erased, and silence restored. And yet there were marks. Ishmael's sons learned early that freedom demands vigilance, that to keep what is theirs, one must understand its value. The desert can be a refuge, but it can also be a battleground. One night, a rival tribe attempted to invade the wells of Massa. They came armed with iron swords and gilded shields, but they did not find undefended camps. They encountered hidden archers, loose stones from high hills, and darts hurled by steady hands. By sunrise, the invaders' bodies lay scattered around the water sources. An aging yet still strong Ishmael walked silently among the fallen. His gaze was hard. There was no glory in that, only necessity. He knelt beside the well, touched the water, looked at his sons gathered around him and said, "Never let them take what God has given us." His sons nodded with their eyes, and they understood. The desert was theirs not by conquest but by survival. They were not made to rule kingdoms, nor were they created to be ruled. Their bodies were resilient, their hands calloused, their families united by blood and by history. As generations passed, the names of Ishmael and his sons began to circulate among the peoples. Some called them barbarians, others savages. Yet all, without exception, held them in respect, for they knew that behind each tribe was a legacy, a name, a pain transformed into strength, an exile turned into territory, a boy who once wept beneath a bush and now saw his descendants protect what God had promised with sweat, dust, and courage. Ishmael did not write laws, but he lived by a code. Never forget where you come from. He did not walk amid crowds, yet every step he took was followed by entire clans. He did not bear crowns. Yet every man who encountered him bowed his head, for they knew that man had been cast out from the promise, but never forgotten by God. And the blood that coursed through him was the same that would sustain his descendants. The desert wind carried more than just dust. It carried promises among the dunes and the silence. In the barren heart of a land where nothing blossomed except perseverance, an ancient sacred word began to fulfill itself before the eyes of the world. What had once been merely an angel's whisper at the edge of a well now took on form, name and blood, Ismael had become a father, not of one nor of two, but of 12 sons. 12 sons who would not only continue his lineage, but would form the foundations of entire tribes. Tribes that grew, spread, and established themselves in the desert regions between Egypt and Assyria. They were no ordinary children. They were princes, as it is written. Genesis 25:16. Each name carried a destiny, each name a banner, each name an inheritance from the man who once wept among thorns with death lurking at his steps. Now his sons walked as lords of the desert. The first Nebi, steadfast and honorable, led with justice and wisdom. His people were known for their trustworthy word and abundant flocks. Next came Kedar, a warrior by nature, an archer like his father, leader of a tribe respected even by their foes. Adil III was a man of prayer and silence, chosen to keep their history alive. Mebam and Mishma, inseparable brothers, were known for their trade routes and their mastery over paths that others feared to tread. Duma and Massa forged alliances with neighboring tribes and spread tents where there had once been nothing but barren land. Their names echoed among caravan traders and nomads as symbols of strength and stability. Hadad VI was impetuous, yet loyal. His decisions swift, and his tribe prospered through boldness. Tamer, though younger, was wise and established councils among his tents to guide older men. Then there were Jur, Narfis, and Kedmar, 3 brothers who spread out to the farthest borders, setting the limits of what would come to be known as the territory of the Ishmaelites. In every extremity of the desert, there was a descendant of Ismael. In every valley, a campfire kindled by one of his sons. In every story told on cold nights, his name was remembered. It was the fulfillment of a promise, visible, inevitable, and eternal. Hagar, now old, watched from a distance with tear-filled eyes. She had seen the boy expelled, the water run dry, hope die, and then be resurrected. Now she saw grandchildren running among the tents, her sons' names honored, and the seed of a nation nurtured with sweat, faith, and perseverance. For his part, Ismael remained steadfast. The same man who had learned to survive alone now taught others how to live in unity. Sitting at the entrance of his tent, he watched his sons return from their journeys with tales of victory, commerce, and alliances. There were no palaces, but there was peace. There were no crowns, but there was honor. He never forgot his origins. He still recalled the hand of Abraham handing him the jar, and sometimes he dreamed of Sarah's eyes, so hard and cold. Yet the past had not poisoned him. It had only shaped him. Now he understood the promise had not been revoked, only redirected. It was not Isaac versus Ismael. They were different stories, distinct paths, both sealed by God's hand. While one generated kings and priests, the other produced desert princes, free men who learned to make every journey an act of resistance and every son a living prophecy. The 12 tribes of Ismael did not live within walls. Yet they knew the limits of respect, their names carried through generations. Centuries later, kings would speak of Kedar, prophets would write of him. Ancient records would mention their caravans. The Israelites would live on in records, in stories, in memories. And it all began with a boy on the brink of death and a mother who could not bear to look at him close. Now, around the well that had saved them, tents rose like witnesses. Sons sat at tables, grandchildren ran, women cooked, and elders told stories. It was a nation, a true nation without kings, without castles, but full of identity, life, and purpose. Ismael walked among the tents as one strolling through a land he had not inherited, but had conquered with faith and endurance. His hands bore the marks of time, his eyes greater depth, and his voice still rang strong. And when he spoke, his sons listened. He gathered the 12 as he always did each season, speaking of the past, the day God heard his cry, the moment when her eyes were opened to the well, the promise that seemed forgotten and now walked by his side. 12 sons, 12 leaders, and a legacy that would echo through the sands of time. The desert does not know clocks. Measuring time, there is an exercise in patience and memory. Age is revealed in the eyes, fatigue in the shoulders, and wisdom In the long silences between words, Ismail was now a patriarch in his full stature. His hair, once as dark as the shadow of the rocks, now bore strands of silver, highlighted by the sun. His weathered skin showed the marks of time. Yet his body remained firm. His hands still gripped his bow with precision, and his name echoed among the tribes as a symbol of strength. No one dared disdain him. Even those who feared him held him in respect. He was more than a hunter, more than a leader. He was a survivor who had become legend. A man born outside the promise who transformed rejection into his own territory. Ismail's fame traversed dunes and valleys. He was known among caravans, respected by merchants, and cited by tribal leaders. When his name was mentioned, the tone of conversations would change. They said he was impossible to surprise, that his ears could detect the sound of a snake slithering many paces away, that his bow was an extension of his arm, that his arrows flew as if they were part of the very wind. These were not mere legends, but true stories. Once a group of northern invaders tried to capture one of the wells controlled by his sons. They came under the cover of night, silent and armed with long blades and cowardly schemes. But they did not count on Ismail himself standing guard. With his bow slung over his back, his eyes alert, and his feet firmly planted in the sand, he positioned himself between the well and the attackers. No words were needed. The sound of the first arrow slicing through the air was enough. It struck just inches from the enemy leader's feet, an unmistakable warning, a reminder. The invaders retreated without a fight, without shouts. For they knew they faced a man who had already overcome battles far greater than any of them could imagine. And it was not only the enemies who recognized his strength. His sons listened to him with reverence, gathering around his fire to hear his youthful stories as if from a prophet. Yet Ismail never spoke of himself as a hero. He spoke with humility, recalling not only his victories, but also his mother's tears, the unseen well, the silence between him and his father. He said it was that silence that taught him to listen to the desert. For the desert does not speak in words. It speaks in signs through wind, heat, and emptiness. In that silence, he learned to move without making a sound, to hunt without killing for vanity, to protect without showing his fangs, and to conquer without the need to seize. Above all, he learned to live without depending on what had been denied to him. There had never been a king over the tribes of Ismail, and there was no need for one. Authority was born from example, from the memory that his people had begun with nothing and now had everything they needed: freedom, identity, and a name no longer associated with pain, but with honor. At tribal ceremonies, when leaders gathered to decide on routes, resources, and alliances, Ismail was always the last to speak, not out of insignificance, but because his word was the final seal. He did not raise his voice among others. Yet when his voice resounded, the desert fell silent. His counsel was brief, yet each phrase carried the weight of entire generations of wisdom, as if the very earth itself were listening. And in his hands, the bow was never far away. He kept it clean and well-tuned, its strings taut. It was more than just a weapon. It was a symbol, a legacy, the object that had accompanied him from youth and now rested among his most cherished memories. During ceremonial days, Ismail would take his bow and release a single arrow at sunset, always aimed in the direction of the wind. It was a simple gesture, yet laden with meaning. The sons watched in silence, the grandsons with wide eyes, and men from other tribes with respect. For that arrow was not merely a piece of wood in flight. It was a reminder, a memory of the time he was cast into the desert with nothing, of how his mother believed he would be lost, of how the world considered him forgotten, and that in that very moment God had heard his voice. The sound of the bow slicing through the air was the sound of resistance, of faith, of rebirth, a sound echoing that of a boy who survived and of a man who learned to grow stronger than his pain. Each arrow released carried the memory of his exile. The sky was gray that day, not because of clouds. The desert rarely sees rain, but because of the grief that hung over the men. There was something different in the wind, slower, heavier, as if even it knew a great man had departed. Abraham, the friend of God, The man of the promise, the pilgrim of faith, had died. His breath had ceased in his advanced years, having lived many days, and been satisfied with life. Genesis 25:8. Yet even men like him, giants in faith, end their journeys in the same earth as all others. Now the father's body lay wrapped in simple cloth awaiting burial, and then after years of silence and distance, Ishmael reappeared. No one had called him. No message had been sent to the distant lands where he lived with his sons and clans. Yet he knew. Blood knows. The heart feels. And a soul that shares the same father recognizes the moment when something changes in the world. He arrived even before Isaac had time to wonder how to receive him. He dismounted with firm steps, his bow on his back, his gaze mature, his face hardened by life, yet bearing an old shadow of the boy who still lived within. Isaac, the son of the promise, was there quietly watching. For a moment, the two brothers looked at each other. No words were exchanged. Isaac held the cloth that enveloped their father's body, while Ishmael, standing at the tent's entrance, merely lowered his head. In that simple gesture, the years vanished. The entire past condensed into a single second. The cry of the desert, the empty jar, Abraham's silence, the presence of God. Everything lay between the two brothers and a body. Together they carried the body to the cave of Machpelah, the site Abraham had chosen years before where Sarah now rested. It was a sacred place purchased with silver, a witness to God's promises and the faith of a man who left everything for a land he had yet to know. Isaac and Ishmael carried the body together. No servant touched it, no help was offered. Only the two sons, the son of the promise and that of the desert, one on each side, guiding the remains of the one who brought them into the world and separated them with decisions that still bled. During the burial, there were no loud prayers, no theatrical laments. Yet the silence spoke, louder than any cry, deeper than any mourning, telling of all that might have been and was not, of all that was lost in time. Ishmael looked at the stone that covered the grave as if it were a mirror. There lay the father he had known and would never see again, the man who loved him yet sent him away, who gave him life and exile. And still Ishmael harbored no hatred. There was pain, yes, and longing certainly, but no rancor. For time had taught him that some wounds heal not through revenge but through understanding. And there, before the cave, he understood. Abraham had done what he believed to be God's will, and he, Ishmael, had survived, prospered, and founded a nation, and now he was burying his father. Isaac on the other side felt the same confusion. The brother before him was a stranger, and yet of his own flesh and blood. The boy he once saw being cast away was now a grown man, a patriarch, a father of princes. For a brief moment, the two were together, not as rivals, not as promise versus rejection, but simply as sons, laying their father to rest. The silence continued. There was neither an embrace of reconciliation nor a gesture of repulsion. There was respect, recognition, a gap between them, not of hatred, but of a history left unshared. When the earth was cast upon the body, Ishmael was the first to walk away. He mounted his steed, took one last look at the cave's entrance, and departed. He did not bid farewell, yet he was not fleeing. Isaac remained. He would continue tending to the lineage of the promise, living among flocks, altars, and the heritage of faith. But he would never see Ishmael again, and Ishmael too would not return. For the desert was his calling, freedom, his destiny, solitude his sacred path. And even with their steps diverging, their stories would never be completely separate. For what truly unites brothers, the passage of time cannot erase, death cannot bury, and God never ignores. On that day, two brothers buried a father in the earth, yet the chasm between them remained alive. The desert sands do not only cover, hide, or bury, they also preserve. Like pages that sway with the wind, they keep alive the memory of those who walked courageously along their paths. Ishmael's name was no longer just that of a man. It had become an ancestral echo, a symbol among the peoples spanning the Arabian Peninsula, from the borders of Egypt to those of the Euphrates, from the mountains to the sea. a name that the wind repeated in silence as it blew among tents and marketplaces. His sons controlled the trade routes, not through armies, but through wisdom, through adaptation, through cunning and endurance. They knew every water source, every shadow cast by a rock, every star that guided the caravans. The desert was not an obstacle, it was a map. The Ishmaelites controlled the paths along which gold, perfumes, myrrh, incense, spices, and salt passed. Phoenician, Babylonian, and Egyptian merchants had to negotiate with them, cross their lands, and respect their agreements. Whoever wished to reach the other side of the world had to pass through where the sons of Ishmael guarded the dunes. For example, the tents of Kedar became legendary. The thick, dark fabrics sewn by the women of the tribes withstood both wind and time. They were visible from afar and served as either a sign of peace or a warning. Centuries later, Hebrew prophets would speak of them. Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, each would mention the tribes of Ishmael as an inescapable reality in the geopolitics of the desert. It was not empire. It was influence. It was not dominion by the sword. It was sovereignty through presence. The sons of Ishmael formed organized clans, each with its own rules, elders, and pacts. Yet all shared something in common, a name that united them, the name of a man not chosen by kings but called by God. Among them, the word freedom was more valuable than any metal. No throne seduced them. No capital attracted them. The dunes were their walls, the starry sky their ceiling. The blazing campfire at dusk was more sacred than any palace. Even the great civilizations recognized them as a distinct people. While the descendants of Isaac organized into tribes along Canaan and built altars, the sons of Israel expanded in circles like the wind that blows in every direction. Their tribes were mobile, their possessions light, their eyes deep. They kept the oral tradition alive. Stories about their father were told under the stars. About the angel who spoke in the desert. About the well that appeared when everything seemed lost. About the bow that never missed. About the weeping of a boy whom God heard. Generations passed, but the names remained. Nebaioth was recognized as the ancestor of the Nabateans, a people who would later build stone cities and dominate trade routes in Arabia. Kedar was cited as a powerful tribe of brave men and honorable women. Duma, Massa, Tema, each name became a lineage, a living history passed on to children and then to their children. They knew who they were. They knew where they came from. And even though they had been expelled from Abraham's household, even though they had not inherited the promised land, they had inherited something that no one could take away. The favor of God, which was promised and fulfilled. Ishmael no longer watched with his own eyes. Time had left him in quiet old age. But what his eyes could no longer see, his seed accomplished. In every well, a tribe. In every market, a name. In every caravan, a trace of the spirit of one who faced death and was uplifted by the hand of the Most High. And even those who did not know his story deeply respected the sound of his name. It was as if the very desert spoke. Here walked one who was forgotten, but not by heaven. Here lived a man who had little, but planted much. Here was born a people without a throne, but with an eternal purpose. Wherever they went, the sons of Ishmael left traces of order, wisdom, and strength. They did not write laws, but they inspired codes. They did not establish temples, but they recognized the signs in the heavens. They did not seek dominion, but made movement their authority. The tribes grew and multiplied, intermarrying with other peoples, and although the years passed, the memory of their father remained alive. For everything they had began with a boy who wept at the foot of a bush, a cry that ascended to heaven and was never forgotten. Men die, but their voices remain. When the desert wind passes through silent tents, it seems to carry ancient whispers, voices buried in dust, memories scattered like seeds in the sand. And among those voices, there was one that refused to be silenced, the voice of Ishmael. His body no longer walked among the living, his hands no longer wielded the bow, his eyes no longer scanned the horizons, but his descendants, alive and growing, resonated throughout the east. The sons of his sons multiplied. From his 12 princes, tribes formed, and from those tribes, kingdoms emerged. They stretched across the deserts of Piran, the plains of Arabia and the borders of Mesopotamia. They were not shadows of the past. They were the roots of the future. What began in exile had now become a people recognized by both heavens and earth. The prophets of Israel, those who received direct revelations from God, began to mention him. Isaiah the visionary wrote about Kedar, son of Ismael, and about his resilient tents, abundant flocks, and bravery. Isaiah 21:16-117. Jeremiah spoke of the desert kingdoms by name, mentioning Duma and the clans descending from the forgotten son. Jeremiah 49:28. Ezekiel, the exile in a strange land, also described the Arab peoples who traded with Tai and welcomed caravans from the lands of Ismail. Ezekiel 27:201. The Bible, which once barely whispered of his birth, now proclaimed his descendants aloud, not as enemies nor as the forgotten, but as a legitimate presence on the pages of prophetic history. Kedar, grandson of Hagar, became a symbol of Arab life, a people of brave men, skilled hunters, and shrewd merchants, and their tents were mentioned not for their frailty but for their durability. The tents of Kedar became an image of strength and permanence. The psalmists also knew that name. Ishmael was no longer merely the boy of the desert. He was now a landmark, a lineage that God allowed to cross the paths of revelation. In Psalm 125, the poet laments, "Woe is me, a wanderer in Mish, and as one dwelling in the tents of Kedar." Even those who saw the Ishmaelites as different recognized their significance. For they were everywhere. Their flocks nourished kingdoms. Their caravans carried riches. Their borders marked the limits of empires. And even those who had never deeply heard the story of Hagar knew the name of their father. Time could not silence him. The distance from Abraham's tent did not erase him from divine memory. God had promised, "I will also make a nation of the servant's son, because he is your offspring." Genesis 21:13. And now the whole world began to hear the echoes of that nation. Among the sacred scrolls in Psalms and visions, the voice of the boy in the desert resounded once more, not as lament, but as testimony, not as noise, but as an answer. His descendants influenced more than commerce. They shaped culture, created codes, traditions, and social structures. And even without thrones, the influence of his sons reached palaces. It was impossible to trace any ancient map without crossing their roots. The prophecy was being fulfilled. The voice of the boy whom God heard while he wept at the foot of a bush now echoed in the voices of the prophets, in the songs of the tribes, in names recorded in sacred scrolls. If Hagar were still alive, she would smile upon seeing this. The despised servant, the woman who fled from suffering, the mother who placed her son beneath a bush, saying, "I cannot bear to watch him die." But he did not die. He lived. He grew. He led. He fathered princes. And now his echo resounded. The scriptures did not forget him. The people did not forget him. And God never forgot. The desert was quiet. There was no dust in the air, no war cries, no noise of caravans, only the slow sound of the wind blowing like a sacred whisper among the stones. It was the end of a cycle, but not the end of a story. Ismael walked alone that morning. He no longer had the same firmness in his steps nor the same strength in his arms, but his eyes carried it all. Memory, faith, pain, fulfillment. Every step was a remembrance. The moment he was cast into the desert, his mother's tears, his father's silence, the moment he thought he would die, and then the voice of God pierced through the dry sky. God has heard the voice of the youth. Genesis 21:17. He never forgot that phrase. It was not merely a verse. It was his life encapsulated in one sentence. Now at the end of his journey, he looked back not with bitterness but with understanding. He was rejected by men, but honored by God. He was expelled from the tents, yet received territory from heaven. He was separated from the promise, but became the promise for multitudes. Ishmael finally understood the mystery that had surrounded him since the womb. It was no coincidence that his name meant God hears. For he was the living embodiment that God listens to, even the forgotten. 1 Samuel 2:30 says, "Those who honor me, I will honor, but those who despise me will be disdained." Ismael did not have an inheritance, but he had faith. He did not have an altar, but he had obedience. He did not have blessings proclaimed aloud, but he received silent responses that changed destinies. While many sought the limelight of history, he walked along the margins. And it was on those margins that God nurtured new beginnings. God did not abandon him. Never. Even when Abraham fell silent, God spoke. Even when Sarah expelled him, God opened a well. Even when there was no water, shelter, or shade, there was God's gaze. His bow no longer cut the heavens. His arrows were now stored away. His feet sought one final resting place, yet his soul burned with the certainty that he had lived precisely as was foretold. I will make him into a great nation. Genesis 21:18. And this was not merely a genetic promise. Ismael became the symbol of redemption for the forgotten, the proof that God does not measure men by human acceptance, but by what he sees in their hearts. He knew he was not just a passing character. He was a testimony. His name would be remembered through the generations. His people would leave marks. His sons would be counted, his tribes respected, and his name would echo to the very last grain of sand. Seated at the entrance of his tent on the plain of Havilah, Ismael lifted his eyes one final time. The sun was setting, yet within him something was being born. Eternity, not made of stones or kings, but of a memory sealed by God. His sons gathered, his wives, grandchildren, and servants assembled, and before all he did not deliver a long speech. He only said, I am the one whom God has heard. They understood, for his story was written on the face of every descendant, in calloused hands, worn sandals, and in the valor of the tribes. God heard him, God saw him, God sustained him. Ismael lay down with his own. He was united with his people, and in the silence of the desert which now received him for the last time, there was no lament, only honor. The voice of the boy who was once forgotten by all, now echoed in the ears of heaven. God heard, God saw, God fulfilled, and he who was rejected became eternal. Time passes, but God's promises remain. The desert sands marked by forgotten footprints continue to move with the wind. Tribes are born, empires fall, civilizations rise again. Yet among all the stories the arid earth has seen, one never fades. The story of Ismael. He was the boy who was not meant to live, the one rejected by society, excluded from the human promise, forgotten in the tents he left without honor. But he was also the one whom God chose to hear. Ishmael did not found a temple, yet his name became the foundation of a people. Ismael did not reign in Jerusalem, yet his sons raised tents that reached the ends of the world. Ismael did not walk with kings, but his blood flows in the arms of warriors, prophets, and poets. His spiritual legacy transcended millennia. It is impossible to recount the history of the peoples of the Middle East and of humanity without mentioning his name. The descendants of Ismael formed powerful tribes such as the Kedorites, Nabateans, and Temanites, whose traces are still studied today in the stones of history and ancient manuscripts. In Islamic tradition, Ismael is considered a prophet and patriarch, a direct ancestor of Muhammad, the founder of Islam. Many Muslims recognize in his lineage a fidelity to Allah and see his life as a symbol of submission and perseverance. The story of the sacrifice in which he was willing to offer himself in faith alongside his father Abraham is commemorated every year during Eid al-Adha, the greatest celebration of surrender and trust in the divine plan. In the biblical records, Ismael remains present not as a supporting character but as living testimony that God does not forget the rejected. The Bible, the Quran, and the Arab oral traditions all preserve his voice. Yet his voice is not merely a distant echo of the past. It still speaks. It speaks to hearts that have long been pushed aside. It speaks to mothers who weep for their children under the weight of exclusion. It speaks to men who wander parched lands unsure if a hidden well lies ahead. It speaks to souls bearing names marked by pain who hope that someone will see them. Ismael is the eternal symbol that God hears. And if he heard a boy in the midst of the sand, alone, weak, forgotten, he still hears. Even today, in times of war and reconciliation, division and reconstruction, the story of Ismael bridges a divide between peoples, between brothers, between faith and identity. It is not a story that ends in a tomb. It is a story that lives wherever there is dust, where there is silence and where there is hope. You who have ever felt outcast, you who were left behind, you who bear no titles or inheritances. The story of Ismael is yours as well, for it proves that it is not men who choose who is remembered. It is God who writes the lines of eternity with fingers of mercy, and the same voice that said, "You shall call his name Ismael because the Lord has heard your affliction," still whispers over the sands of your life. The world may forget, people may turn away, but God hears, God sees, and God acts. And the story of Israel is not merely recounted, it still speaks. If you enjoyed this story, 2 more videos featuring impactful biblical stories like Ismael's will appear on your screen. Click to watch them and don't forget to subscribe to the channel and leave a like. May God be with.